Yeah,
Yeah.
tell us why. Yeah.
Because I'm looking at myself in the monitor and trying not to judge myself too harshly right now, because I know that I'm still holding on to this weight because it's protecting me right now, because I'm going through a lot of challenges, a lot of heartbreak.
For years, Valerie Bertinelli kept quiet. The world saw a rock and roll romance, beautiful, chaotic, and iconic. But now, in a rare and emotional moment, she breaks down, revealing the truth behind her divorce from Eddie Van Halen. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't bitterness. It was something far more heartbreaking. Unresolved love, addiction, and letting go of someone she never stopped caring for. Her voice cracked, her eyes welled, and suddenly the world saw the woman behind the headlines, the golden couple that captivated America. In the early 1980s, they were the couple that had it all. Valerie Bertinelli, America's bubbly TV darling, and Eddie Van Halen, the electrifying guitar legend, seemed like the perfect match. She was already a two-time Golden Globe winner before turning 21. He was redefining the sound of rock, with Van Halen dominating the charts. Their love story looked like a dream. The clean-cut actress marrying the wild, rebellious rocker. Hollywood couldn't get enough of them. They met in 1980 and were married within a year. Headlines celebrated them as the ultimate opposites who attracted America's sweetheart and rock's bad boy. The wedding was star-studded, the smiles were bright, and the flashbulbs never stopped. But what the cameras didn't capture was how different their lives really were. Valerie was used to structure, call times, scripts, controlled sets. Eddie thrived on chaos, midnight jam sessions, unpredictable tours, and a band that lived like they were invincible. From day one, they were in love, but they weren't on the same path. Underneath the glitz and red carpets, they were two people living parallel lives, constantly crossing but never fully connecting. What the world saw was glamour. But what Valerie lived was imbalance. She would later say in her memoir, "We were chasing the image of what we thought we should be, but the reality was far messier." Fast love, faster lives. From the moment they said, "I do," life moved at breakneck speed. Valerie was filming sitcoms by day and flying to join Eddie on tour by night, bouncing between two completely different worlds. One was lit by studio lights and makeup chairs, the other by pyrotechnics and heavy metal guitar solos. In those early years, the passion was undeniable, but the pace was unsustainable. Valerie craved emotional presence. Eddie, wrapped in the intensity of stardom, lived for the next show, the next riff, the next escape. She once described their relationship as two satellites orbiting the same star, but never landing on the same planet. And then came the pressure. Fame magnified everything. There were no quiet moments to heal or reset. When cracks formed, there were no private spaces to hide in, just tabloid covers, cameras, and curious fans. Their love wasn't a lie, but it was happening under extreme pressure. And as the schedules grew crazier, so did the emotional distance. The world may have seen a fairy tale, but Valerie saw the signs. I wanted a home. He wanted the world. Addiction, the quiet. Third partner in their marriage. As if fame and differences weren't enough, there was a deeper, darker presence shaping their lives. Addiction. Eddie's drug and alcohol use began casually but escalated fast. By the mid-80s, substance abuse had become a silent but dominating third presence in their marriage. Valerie tried to support him through it all. Detoxes, rehab, relapse after relapse. She loved him deeply, but the man she married was slipping away behind closed doors. She admitted in her memoir that she even tried cocaine a few times to keep up, but it wasn't her. It made me feel like I didn't exist. Over time, Eddie became physically present, but emotionally unreachable. Valerie shifted into caregiver mode, holding their world together while falling apart herself. Love had turned into duty, passion into pain. The deeper his addiction ran, the more isolated she became. There were nights I would lie in bed next to him and still feel like I was completely alone. She wasn't just losing her husband, she was losing herself. Loneliness in the spotlight. To the public, Valerie and Eddie were still one of Hollywood's most iconic couples. But behind their polished image, Valerie was drowning in silence. Despite being surrounded by fame, friends, and fans, she had never felt lonelier. The emotional disconnect in their marriage was no longer subtle. It was deafening. Eddie had his band, his vices, his world. Valerie had the pressure to smile, perform, and pretend everything was okay. At one point, Valerie admitted she had an affair, not out of betrayal, but out of desperation for connection. "I needed to feel seen. I needed to feel like I mattered to someone," she wrote. The loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual. Meanwhile, Eddie's own infidelities surfaced, trust crumbled. Their marriage became more about routine than love. They showed up for events, smiled for the cameras, but at home, there was a wall neither could climb over anymore. What once felt like partnership had become a stage act, one they both grew exhausted of performing. A son, a breaking point, and a hard choice. What finally broke Valerie wasn't a fight or another relapse. It was watching her son, Wolfgang, absorb their dysfunction. By the late 90s, Valerie realized the environment they had created wasn't just damaging their marriage, it was affecting their child. Wolfgang deserved more than two broken people faking love for appearances. She once told a friend, "We weren't acting like people in love." And that's what our son was watching every day. In 2001, she made the hardest decision of her life. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. She chose to separate. For Wolfgang, for herself. The official divorce didn't come until 2007, but emotionally, Valerie had let go much earlier. "I needed to be a better mother, and I couldn't do that while living a lie." It was the most painful chapter, but also the bravest. Because for the first time, Valerie chose peace over performance, and that choice would eventually lead her toward healing. The silent separation that confused the world. When Valerie and Eddie quietly separated in 2001, most people didn't even notice. There were no dramatic headlines, no bitter interviews, no court battles, just silence. For a couple so famous, so watched, it was strange. The world had seen every phase of their relationship. Why was this part happening in the shadows? The answer was simple. Valerie was protecting her peace. Instead of drawing attention to their private pain, she stepped back. No talk shows, no red carpets. She focused on motherhood and stayed out of the spotlight. And in doing so, she left the public confused. Fans speculated everything, from cheating to burnout to clashing careers. But no one really knew the truth. What made it even more mysterious was how polished their public image remained. They still appeared at their son's events together. They smiled in family photos. They never threw each other under the bus. It didn't look like a divorce. It looked like a pause. But behind the scenes, Valerie was grieving something very real. She had spent 2 decades holding a marriage together while slowly losing herself. Letting go was the only path to healing, but it came at a cost. The silence was necessary, but it was also isolating. She was mourning a love that had long ago stopped being loving. Looking back, Valerie has said it was one of the loneliest, but most honest decisions of her life. She chose not to make a spectacle out of their pain. She chose dignity, and even though the world didn't understand it then, that quiet exit was her first step toward freedom. The real story comes out years later. For years, Valerie kept her story tucked away. But in 2008, that changed. Her memoir, Losing It, pulled back the curtain on everything. The addiction, the betrayal, the loneliness, and the strength it took to walk away. The book was raw, not bitter, not angry, just honest. Valerie didn't paint herself as a victim, nor did she vilify Eddie. She told the truth as she lived it. "I stayed too long. I lost myself trying to save him," she wrote. And for the first time, people saw the real cost of keeping up appearances. She opened up about how Eddie's struggles with alcohol and drugs shaped their entire relationship. She admitted her own mistakes, like seeking validation from others during their marriage. But more than anything, she talked about what it felt like to be in love with someone who wasn't fully present. Her tears in interviews weren't just about the past. They were about finally releasing the weight she'd carried for decades. Valerie explained that the hardest part wasn't the divorce. It was realizing that the fairy tale had never really existed. She said, "We loved each other, but we were never healthy for each other." The memoir didn't just change how the public saw Valerie, it redefined her. She wasn't just Eddie Van Halen's ex or a sitcom star. She was a woman who survived emotional burnout, found her voice, and dared to tell the truth when it was easier to stay quiet. The fantasy of soulmates and the hard truth. For a long time, Valerie and Eddie called each other soulmates, even after the divorce. But years later, Valerie admitted it wasn't real. It was something they wanted to believe in more than they actually lived. "Nothing about it made me feel loved. Nothing screamed soulmate," she confessed in an interview. And when she watched her son Wolfgang's Behind the Music episode, everything hit her at once. She saw the pain through her son's eyes, the confusion, the history, the pattern. It forced her to let go of the story she had been telling herself for decades. They were connected, yes, but not in a way that was healthy. They had deep love, but not deep compatibility. They had chemistry, but not peace. And that realization hurt more than any breakup. She cried, not for Eddie, but for the dream they both tried so hard to keep alive. Valerie described it as mourning a ghost. Something you can't touch but can't forget. She finally understood that some relationships aren't meant to last forever, no matter how much love is there. And sometimes the most painful truth is realizing that love alone is not enough. Her honesty resonated deeply with fans. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was a quiet reckoning, the kind that only comes after years of reflection. Valerie's tears weren't just about Eddie. They were about everything she gave up trying to be what they both wanted her to be. Post-divorce love and the search for peace. After her divorce from Eddie, Valerie did what many people do. She tried to move on. In 2011, she married businessman Tom Vitalo, hoping for a fresh start. At first, it seemed promising. New love, a calmer life, a second chance at happiness. But by 2022, that marriage also ended. And this time, Valerie didn't hide. She spoke honestly about why it didn't work. "I stayed longer than I should have, not because I was happy, but because I was hopeful." Her second divorce wasn't explosive. It was quiet, like the first. But emotionally, it marked a huge shift. Valerie had finally realized that love without emotional safety or mutual growth wasn't enough. She had spent most of her life trying to be the perfect partner. What she really needed was to be a complete version of herself. She didn't frame it as failure. She framed it as learning. "I'm not broken. I'm just done playing roles that don't fit me anymore," she told fans. This marked her real turning point, not just moving on from Eddie or Tom, but from the pattern of choosing love over self-worth. She stopped settling for the idea that love had to come with suffering. She chose peace, clarity, herself. Co-parents until the end. Even after all the heartbreak, distance, and emotional unraveling, Valerie Bertinelli and Eddie Van Halen never stopped showing up for their son. Despite the end of their marriage, they shared something stronger than romance, a bond through parenthood that remained unshaken. Their son, Wolfgang, was the thread that held them together long after love had evolved into something else. They made a quiet pact. No matter what had happened between them, they would raise him with love, respect, and unity. They attended his concerts together, celebrated his birthdays side by side, and shielded him from the worst parts of their past. They never made their pain his burden. And in a world where broken families often fracture beyond repair, Valerie and Eddie chose something different: peace. In 2020, when Eddie's cancer battle reached its final stage, Valerie was there. She didn't hesitate. She stepped into the hospital room not as an ex-wife, but as someone who had known him better than anyone else. She held his hand. She whispered her goodbyes. And in those last moments, the past didn't matter. Only love did. Later, she posted a simple but powerful tribute. "I will see you in our son's eyes forever." It was a sentence that said everything and left nothing unsaid. Their story didn't end in reunion, but it did end in grace. What once was passion became understanding. What once was pain became compassion. And what once was chaos finally settled into calm. It wasn't the fairy tale they had dreamed of in the early 80s. There was no dramatic reunion, no rekindled romance, but there was a healing, quiet, steady, and deeply human. They reached a place that many ex-couples never find: kindness. Their connection had changed shape, but it never disappeared. Through the tears, through the silence, through the long nights apart, they still managed to protect what mattered most: their son and the quiet dignity of a shared life. Valerie taught the world that closure doesn't always come with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments, the steady presence, the final goodbye whispered in love, not regret. And in letting go of the pain, she honored the part of their love that was still pure. She gave Eddie and herself the one thing they never found in marriage, but found in the end: peace. From grief to growth. When Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020, Valerie's world quietly collapsed. Though they had been divorced for over a decade, the bond they shared through love, heartbreak, parenthood, and history ran far deeper than any label could hold. Eddie wasn't just an ex-husband. He was the father of her child, her first love, the man she had tried to save and finally had to let go. His death hit her with unexpected force. It reopened wounds she thought had healed. It brought back memories, beautiful, painful, chaotic, and unfinished. And it left her with one undeniable truth: she had loved him with everything she had, even when it cost her parts of herself. She shared her grief with the world in a short, heartfelt tribute. "Thank you for the best years of my life. I will see you in our son's smile forever." It was tender, but also final. It didn't pretend they'd had a perfect love. It simply honored the connection they could never fully sever. But behind the public words was a private reckoning. Valerie began to reflect, not just on the love they shared, but on what that love had taken from her. In the months that followed, she let herself feel everything she had held back for years. The grief gave her permission to speak more openly, to stop protecting Eddie's legacy at the expense of her truth. For the first time, she acknowledged out loud what it was like to live beside addiction, to lose yourself in someone else's chaos, to carry the weight of a relationship that had stopped being safe. Eddie was a genius, a music icon, but he was also flawed. And loving him meant living in the space between brilliance and brokenness. Valerie finally admitted to herself that she had stayed longer than she should have, not out of weakness, but out of hope. Hope that he would change. Hope that love would be enough. Letting go of that hope was harder than the divorce itself. But with that release came clarity. Valerie began to grow, not in spite of the grief, but because of it. She embraced the sadness, but she didn't let it define her. She didn't try to rewrite the past. She simply learned from it. And in doing so, she began healing not just from Eddie, but from every version of herself that had disappeared in the effort to hold everything together. What started as loss became transformation. And in the space where grief once sat, growth took root. Choosing sobriety, self-love, and advocacy. By 2022, Valerie Bertinelli had stepped into a chapter of her life that was no longer about appearances, relationships, or roles. It was about truth. Quietly and without fanfare, she made a decision that would shape everything moving forward. She stopped drinking. It wasn't a public announcement meant to impress anyone. It was a private promise to herself. "I wanted to feel everything clearly. No more numbing," she said. Those words didn't come from a place of shame. They came from strength. She wasn't hiding anymore, and she didn't want to dilute the feelings she had spent years suppressing. But sobriety was just the beginning. It became the doorway to something much deeper: self-respect. Valerie started redefining her entire life, her boundaries, her friendships, her work, even the way she spoke to herself. She let go of people who drained her. She stopped explaining herself. And most importantly, she started saying no without guilt. She began opening up about her lifelong struggles with anxiety, panic attacks, and low self-worth, topics she once kept locked away behind a camera-ready smile. In one brave moment, she even filmed herself during a panic attack. Not for attention, not for likes, but to say, this is real. This is what it looks like. You're not alone. Her honesty shook people because they didn't see a celebrity falling apart. They saw a woman rising. Her fans, many of whom had followed her since the 70s, suddenly saw a side of her that was raw, relatable, and deeply human. Valerie wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just finally being herself. Her memoirs, Losing It and Enough Already, became more than just books. They were lifelines. She didn't write to sell copies. She wrote to connect. Her message was simple. It's okay to break down. It's okay to start over. It's okay to choose you. Through every page, she pulled back the curtain on fame, marriage, grief, and guilt. But what readers found most powerful wasn't the pain, it was the healing. Valerie's journey had transformed. No longer about what she'd lost, it became a story of what she'd finally found. Clarity, peace, and the courage to live out loud. From heartbreak to hope, from silence to advocacy, Valerie had become more than a survivor. She became a voice for every woman reclaiming herself after years of putting everyone else first. Who Valerie is now and what she wants us to know today, Valerie Bertinelli is no longer defined by who she once stood beside. She's not just the former wife of a rock legend or the smiling sitcom star holding back tears. She's stepped forward, fully and unapologetically, as her own person, a woman who's lived, learned, and finally let go of the weight she carried for decades. She's made it clear that her value isn't tied to being wanted, needed, or admired. After years of playing roles, on screen and in life, Valerie is now writing her own script. She's found peace in being alone, strength in being honest, and purpose in being real. Her days aren't shaped by red carpets or media expectations. They're built around quiet joy, firm boundaries, and emotional clarity. In her own words, "My tears weren't weakness. They were release. They were the moment I stopped pretending everything was fine." That moment was more than just personal. It was transformative. Valerie is no longer asking to be understood. She's speaking, and those who need to hear her are listening. She's become a voice for anyone who's loved too hard, stayed too long, or lost themselves trying to save someone else. Her healing isn't loud. It's steady, grounded, and genuine. She shares her journey not to prove anything, but to remind others that it's never too late to come home to yourself. Through grief, addiction, heartbreak, and silence, Valerie didn't just survive, she grew. And now, without apology or fear, she's finally living life on her own terms. Not broken, not bitter, just free. This is Valerie, and this is just the beginning. Valerie didn't leave Eddie because she stopped loving him. She left because love alone wasn't enough to heal him. Through tears and truth, she honored their bond, not as a failed marriage, but as a forever connection. In her pain, she gave the world something rare, raw, honest love.